Hello BookTube. So if you've been watching this channel for the past few months, you'll know that one of my reading projects this year is to read more about ancient history, specifically at the moment ancient Mesopotamia. Last month I stumbled across Assyria by Eckhart Fram. Just randomly found this while browsing the shelves of my local bookstore. And I thought, yeah, this is exactly what I'm interested in. So I picked this up and I reviewed it last month on this channel. And if you missed it, I'll leave a link to it in the description down below. But after having read a book about Assyria, then the next thing to read would be a book about Babylon. Now, unfortunately, my local bookstore didn't have a prominent book about Babylon on its shelves. So I went to Google and I typed in, history, Babylon book. And the first thing that popped up, the Babylon history book that everyone seemed to be recommending, was Babylon by Paul Kriwaczek, I think. So I ordered this from my local library through interlibrary loan, and it arrived, and I have read it, and here's my review. So I guess the first thing that needs to be said is that the title isn't entirely accurate. The book's really not about Babylon. In fact, the subtitle here, Mesopotamia and the Birth of Civilization, is actually what the book's about. So it's about ancient Mesopotamia, including Babylon, but Babylon, including both Old Babylon and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, including both of those, I'd say the Babylonian parts of this book are maybe only 20%. The other 80% is on ancient Mesopotamia and other musings of the author. And in that 20%, I felt like I didn't really learn that much about the history of Babylon, which is kind of what I wanted out of this book and what I didn't get. He does talk about the old Babylonian Empire, but he doesn't really go into a traditional history of it. He kind of jumps from random musing to random musing. So he talks about like the excavation of the area, how they discovered the site. Then he talks about some of the Babylonian laws, Hammurabi, talks about Babylonian algebra, talks about Babylonian schooling and how literacy was taught in ancient Babylon, but doesn't really give like what you would expect from a history book, which is kind of tracing the rise and fall of the old Babylonian Empire. And similarly with the Neo-Babylonian Empire, you don't really get much in the way of a traditional history. But this isn't really a traditional history. This is more thoughts about ancient Mesopotamia. So the author of this book, according to the bio here, is a BBC journalist. And this book reads like something a journalist would write instead of a historian. For better or for worse. I guess we'll start with the better. It is, for the most part, readable. You can tell, maybe even just flipping through this, well, I don't know, maybe you can, that it's written large pages with big font, not too intimidating in terms of the text. The prose, when you get into it, is breezy, conversational, it flows. It's not a serious academic book, and I wasn't looking for a serious academic book. I was looking for a popular history. The thing is, and there are pros and cons to this, but he's very concerned with making this history relevant. So he doesn't just want to give a straight history of Mesopotamia. Now, to be fair, he has a bibliography for further reading, in which, if you're interested in a history of Mesopotamia, he gives you some readable authors to look up. He says that these authors are very readable and write engaging histories. So I may have to check these authors out next, see if I can track down these authors through interlibrary loan. But until that day, this is the book I've read here. So he starts off the book by talking about the Iraq War. He talks about Saddam Hussein being hanged. He paints a picture of the hanging. He comments that the hanging was almost biblical in nature. And then there's a bit of an odd passage where he retells the hanging of Saddam Hussein in kind of mock biblical language. Then he goes into a digression about how George W. Bush, Saddam's opponent, also talked about the war in Iraq in terms of religious terms. According to one journalist quoted somewhere, George W. Bush at one point said he was doing what God told him to do with the invasion of Iraq, and showed how both Saddam and Bush were using the religious language. Then we get into talking about how Saddam Hussein had framed his regime using symbols from ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon and Assyria. Then we get into a little passage talking about the irony about how the U.S. had overthrown secular regimes in the Middle East, like Saddam, and then fundamental Islamic regimes had rushed in to fill the vacuum. Makes a comparison to what happened in Iran with the overthrow of the Shah in 1953. Then he talks about some of his own traveling in the region, and you can kind of see maybe that this is less a traditional history where we start in the past and just kind of work our way forward, and more of a lot of just thoughts around the area. Now, to be fair, his first chapter is subtitled An Introduction. So, Lessons from the Past, an Introduction. So, right away, we're not even supposed to be getting to the main content here in the first chapter. But the second chapter as well is not in any more of a hurry to get to the point. He goes on digressions. He starts a lot of the chapters talking about something more recent in history, and then we'll later go back to connect it to the ancient history. It's that kind of a book. He also is prone to a lot of philosophical reflections about the nature of history. So when he gets to the birthplace of civilization, talks about what it is in man that caused this civilization, how every society has traditionalists versus innovators. He's really interested in following his train of thought through interesting philosophical digressions as he progresses through history. Now, ordinarily, I quite like this approach to history. I usually praise a book when the author has done a lot to make the history more relevant, when the author has connected the points in the ancient history to something more relatable in the modern day. And I've looked at a few reviews of this book and listened to a few reviews of other people on YouTube. And other people seem to like that about this book. I found, for whatever reason, this book was a little bit hard for me to get into because, well, I don't know why, but possibly because there wasn't much of a straight narrative. It was a lot more jumping around. At least that's the excuse I'm giving myself. I don't know. Maybe it was just the mood I was in. Maybe I was just having trouble focusing this past week. Maybe I was expecting something a lot more like this Assyria book, which I just read, and maybe this colored my expectations. Maybe it was just me. But I did find, as I was reading this book, quite often losing my focus on it. And you know that thing where you're reading and then you realize that you've been thinking about something else the past 2 pages, and you haven't really been absorbing what the author is saying, and so then you have to go back and reread it. Now, granted, I'm prone to this. In fact, if you've been watching this channel, you've probably heard me mention this reading experience with several books. So, again, it could just be me, but even though I am prone to it, I have this problem with some books more than others. And this was a book I had more of that problem with, for whatever reason. I do think, perhaps, that he does kind of go a little bit overboard with his digressions. So, for example, he mentions a Mesopotamian ruler who demonstrated his physical prowess to his subjects by running some sort of marathon, and then writing up how wonderful it is that he ran before his people and demonstrated what a great runner he was. And the author makes a comparison to Mao Zedong and his swimming the Yangtze River, which is a good comparison to make, I think, if it was just a one-sentence comparison. So like something like, although this may seem strange to us nowadays, it's really not so different. Consider that in 1972, or whatever, Mao Zedong, a modern ruler, used the same tactic by swimming the Yangtze River. But, so that kind of thing would have been fine. But he doesn't do that. He goes on about it for like 2 paragraphs. So he says, Mao Zedong, he had disappeared at the beginning of the 60s. There was bitter infighting in the Communist Party. Then Mao Zedong emerged and he used the Red Guards to consolidate his hold on power. He swam the Yangtze River. The communist press in China recorded that he had swum much faster on it than the previous swimming record. And this is accounted for, people think, by the current of the Yangtze River being able to help him along. The Chinese press at the time circulated pictures of Mao swimming with a bunch of young people, and you can see his head bobbing along in the Yangtze River, etc. So he goes into, I think, more detail on the digression than is probably warranted for the point he wants to make. And a lot of his digressions are like that, where instead of just mentioning something briefly to connect this to modern history or more recent times, he just goes off for like a couple paragraphs or sometimes a couple pages. Again, he's more interested in these tangents and following his train of thought than he is in giving a traditional history, and advantages and disadvantages to this approach. Like I said, a lot of other people seem to really like it. Because this was a popular history, it was also released as an audiobook, and a few of the YouTubers I've watched reviewing this book, some of them said that they did it as an audiobook. I wonder, actually, if I would have enjoyed this more as an audiobook, if that kind of discursive style would have lended itself more to audio, at least for my taste. I did actually, Google Play on YouTube has a sample on YouTube where you can, I think, listen to the first hour and a half of this book on audiobook, the first couple chapters. And after I finished reading the book, I did listen to part of it. And I did find, actually, as audio with somebody talking to me, it sounding more like a conversation. Maybe I enjoyed this book more. I don't know. All that being said, it would be an exaggeration to say that I learned nothing from this book. I did learn a number of useful things. For one thing, I think I've got more of an idea of the chronology of Mesopotamian history now. And I also have a much better idea of the languages, which is something I've been confused about for some time. So, what's the difference between Assyrian and Babylonian, for example? From this book, I learned that both Assyria and Babylon spoke a dialect of Akkadian, a northern and southern dialect. So that's something that Eckhart Fromm alludes to in his book on Assyria when he talks about Babylon and Assyria being two nations separated by a common language. But I guess I wasn't sure, or if Eckhart Fromm mentioned it, I forgot it. Apologies in that case. But this is the book that made it clear to me what the relationship between Babylon and Assyria were linguistically. And also how Sumerian gradually transferred over into Akkadian, how that switch happened in Mesopotamia, which again is something that has been alluded to in some of the other books I read, like the Introduction to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which started out as Sumerian poems, but later turned into an Akkadian epic. This book gives an idea of where these languages came, what language families they were, and this book also talks about what happened to the Akkadian of Babylon and Assyria, how it ended up getting overrun by Armenian, which Armenian was the language of Palestine in the time of Jesus, I believe. Jesus and his disciples, I think, were Armenian speakers. Despite the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek, Jesus didn't actually speak Greek. So it was interesting from this book to see where that Armenian came from. And yeah, speaking of the Bible, this book touches base with the Bible lots of times when it talks about the Babylonian and the Assyrian empires. So, most Western readers, myself included, are most familiar with these empires through their portrayal in the Bible. So it makes it relevant to the reader that he spends some time touching base there with what was happening in Israel and Judea, and Israel and Judah, and how that related to what was going on in Mesopotamia. So yeah, I think Judea is the Roman province, right? Judah was the kingdom in the time of the Babylonian Empire. Is that right? Am I getting that right? But anyways. So yeah, some interesting stuff in here. It just be aware that it's not so much a straight history. It's a lot of musings and digressions filled into this book, for better or for worse. And if you've read this book, let me know how you found it. Did you often find yourself getting distracted when you were reading this? Did you have problems getting into it because of the way the subject kept jumping all over the place? Or did you quite enjoy it? Did you read it, or did you do it as an audiobook, etc.? On the whole, I think it's worth tracking down, especially if you can get it for free from your local library. So go to your local library, maybe request it through interlibrary loan. If you're interested in the time period, it's worth reading.